So I must admit that it was very wonderful to see the presentation beforehand because it was talking about greenhouse emissions. And one of the things that they brought towards that, and I think today our goal is to listen from all our different speakers here and giving us examples of lessons learned and successes. But really, we have to first thank the government of Egypt for putting this panel and allowing us to come here as part of the side event. So we'd like to thank the government of Egypt, specifically the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Planning, the Ministry of Finance, and the wonderful COP27 side event team here in the Green Zone that has been putting all the side events this week and next. In moving forward in that, I'd like to introduce our special speakers today. So we have a few speakers from around the world. I'll start with my colleague, Ms. Carolyn Nguyen. She is the Director for Private Sector Engagement and Private Sector Partnerships at the White House's Council for Environmental Quality. Also joined by my colleague, Mr. Dag Stransnes, who is the Chief Public Procurement Officer and Division Director for the government in Norway. Also, Ms. Yumi, who's a research specialist at the Korean Environment Institute of Technology and Industry, if I got that right. And we already know my colleague Jonathan, who will speak later on today, and my dear friend, Ms. Sina Habous, who is a sustainability consultant, has been working in the area for quite some time at the Center for Environment and Development for the Arab region and Europe. Welcome, everyone. Today's session really is in line with COP27's theme. And if anyone remembers the theme, who's seen the slogan throughout the week, and it's Together for Implementation. And we really brought a panel that is going to talk about how governments are working together for implementation. And what better way to talk about implementation than to hand it off to my good colleague, Jonathan. Jonathan?
Thank you, Alice. So yes, I mean, at the United Nations Environment Program, we've been actually looking at the issue of sustainable procurement for quite a number of years now. Since 2005, actually, we've been really focusing on bringing that topic higher on the agenda. And public procurement is actually really important. My expertise is in the building sector, and when we look at infrastructure and buildings, hospitals, schools, roads, all this is public procurement. So there can be really a wide transformation happening by introducing sustainable procurement there. Currently, if you look at the emissions from the building sector, we're talking about 37% of energy-related CO2 emissions, and 10% of that is actually related to embodied carbon, which is basically all the materials that are used in the building. So there can be really we can drastically reduce those emissions actually if we do better procurement of, well, low carbon cement or whatever technology that is actually bringing low carbon. And at UNEP, what we've been doing in the agenda of sustainable procurement actually is that we've been developing a methodology and an approach on how you actually can develop your sustainable procurement policies. And we've been working since 2009 with more than 20 countries on that specific issue, and helping them setting up their public procurement policies. In addition to that, we're also looking, UNEP is the custodian of what is called SDG 12, which is the Sustainable Consumption and Production related Sustainable Development Goal. And what we've been actually monitoring specifically SDG 12 and how procurement has been contributing, and sustainable procurement has been contributing to advancing on SDG 12. So that's also something that we've been doing under the Sustainable Public Procurement Program of the One Planet Network. So overall, what I want to mention is that, if we want to mitigate climate change, we actually have to implement sustainable procurement policies. In 2015, we had organized with the Koreans the drafting of the first declaration around the mitigation of the climate change through sustainable public procurement. And that declaration was presented actually at the COP21 in Paris. And so we're still continuing to push the agenda of sustainable public procurement, specifically also here under the climate agenda. Of course, I mentioned SDG 12 before, which is much broader than mentioning only the issue of climate, but we are here at the COP. We're here to talk about the climate. So we just want to underline that. So there are some specific elements that have been put forward in terms of public procurement under the Seoul Declaration, and which was calling upon the public and the private purchasers to make use of procurement to fully contribute to climate change mitigation objectives that were agreed by the international community. And some of the key points that were actually underlined specifically in that call was actually the consideration of the climate impacts of the goods and services that are being procured. Looking specifically, how can we integrate better life cycle costing? Because that's a very important element when we look at, whatever we look at, actually, we should always have a life cycle perspective. We have, especially if I go back to the building sector, in the building sector, there's been a lot of work on operational energy, reducing operational energy, and a lot of action on the energy efficiency side. I'm not saying we have achieved what we want to achieve, but we actually have made quite a bit of progress. But we have overlooked actually the whole part of embodied carbon, which is actually everything that we purchase. So there is actually a very good opportunity, to actually take this approach of a whole life carbon approach that we call, and this is something that actually would need to be applied with every product that we are putting forward, so that we have a clear idea of the real cost of actually the different technologies or materials or equipment that we are procuring. The second very important point is to increase the collaboration between the different partners. And when we talk about different partners, there's of course the government, but the government has different layers. There's the central government, there's city level, there's state level governments. So it's really important to actually bring on board all these different partners, but then they also need to work with the private sector. And then they need to work also with the other communities, whether they are the public, I would say the NGOs or the civil society, but also specifically the research community that can also really support with developing the solutions. Overall, I think the radical collaboration is a key thing if we want to kind of overcome the challenges of climate change. As long as people work in silos, we cannot succeed. So I think that's a very important element to put forward here, and which was well underlined in the Seoul Declaration, actually. Now, I would like to take the opportunity of being here to put forward a new goal that we want to take forward with the United Nations Environment Programme, is that we would like to set up a global alliance on low carbon public procurement. And our intention is to launch that at COP28. So we want to call upon actors and organizations to join us towards joining this global alliance and setting up this global alliance. The main objectives of the alliance would actually be to build the case for low carbon public procurement and especially improve the knowledge. There are a number of very good practices already that exist out there, examples. Some countries have already done some great job. There are examples there that others can learn from. And then, of course, we want to support the implementation of the low carbon public procurement. And there specifically for us continuing working on policy advocacy and some of the capacity building, because it's very important, of course, to build the capacities around this issue. So overall, what we are going to be looking into is we want to be able to publish a biannual report on the progress of low carbon public procurement. And out of that publication, we will be able to show some national fact sheets and show how the different countries are progressing towards this goal of low carbon public procurement. Like I mentioned, we can all learn from each other. So we want to also create more exchanges between the countries and between the different stakeholders about the topic. And we want to establish some kind of, I would say, monitoring framework so that we're able to actually, I would say, monitor the progress overall in terms of low carbon procurement policies and the outcomes that are coming from it. So, and maybe just the final point, I mean, the commitment of countries, or at least what is put on the table in the Paris Agreement, is what we call the nationally determined contributions. And so everybody's looking at integrating all the things that we are doing in the NDCs, because that's the vision that a country will put forward in its commitment. And so, of course, it's also in the context of the NDCs that we want to make sure that the public procurement is actually put forward more strongly. There is actually already, I think, quite a bit of movement, and I would say some private sector actors are taking, I think, strong stands in pushing towards sustainable procurement. So I think also that public procurement can learn from a number of private sector organizations. And actually at COP26, there are about 60 of the largest architecture, engineering, and construction firms that have actually signed the 1.5 degree commitment at COP26. And actually there they are putting forward the procurement also on ensuring that their supply chains, where we were seeing the previous presentation where they were talking about scope 1, scope 3, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, but when we talk about scope 3 emissions specifically, that's where we talk about supply chains, and that's where we can also make a real difference. So seeing that commitment, I think, is a very positive signal.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and we look forward to hearing how this initiative develops as we move forward to COP28. But here at COP27, thinking about implementation, collaboration, and what initiatives are happening around the world, before we kind of start, can I get a show of hands? How many are government officials here? Academics? NGOs? Wonderful. Okay, great. And for those, I think online we have a lot of public procurement officers definitely coming in. How many of you have heard of sustainable public procurement? I can get a raise of hand. All right. So let's make sure that we're all on the same page before we kind of learn about what is this, unassuming silent tool that governments have been using to put kind of their money where their words are. And it's, I can kind of start with this. I really love the good water that we had here at COP27. It's, natural mineral water. You have, everything's made out of plant-based extract, and the packaging is, everything's very environmental friendly. How can we implore more of these goods, services, and technologies together in a way that would combat climate change? And if you think about consumption and who's the end user, and this is, a lot of these slides are from our colleagues at UNEP, particularly Mr. Farid Yakir, so I thank him for lending me some of these slides, and along with my colleagues here. If you look at institutional purchasing altogether, you're talking about 10.1 trillion USD of gross domestic product. Can you imagine what that means at the end of the day compared to household goods and exports? So the question is, under institutional purchasing, when governments are a major stakeholder of purchasing and being part of that end user, they are in the best position to really step forward and lead the charge and working with the private sector in changing the way goods are made, services are procured and delivered, and how they impact the end user, us, all of us. Next slide, please. I don't know if I have the clicker. It's up here. And if you look at the different countries here, you see a very range between 70% to 17% of how much each of these countries, where public procurement is part of their gross domestic product. And you have 2 trillion euros on the EU side, 1.7 trillion on USD side, and the world combined 11 trillion. Now that's important to note these numbers is how does it relate at the end of the day? What does it mean to you and for those folks who are listening here online? It's the fact that governments really are at the forefront of having the opportunity to combat climate change by the way they purchase goods, services, and others. So here's our definition of sustainable public procurement. You can read it. I'm not going to read it for you. But there's one thing to highlight the difference in regular public procurement, green procurement, and sustainable public procurement. And colleagues, please let me know if I need to skew in one direction or another in this definition. But public procurement, our focus is to get transparent, effective, competitive, low-cost goods and services for government. In green procurement, our goal is environmentally friendly goods, services, and products. On sustainable public procurement, you're looking at the value for money for the whole life cost of whatever you're purchasing as a government entity. And in that aspect, it really depends on 3 pillars. And you can tell it's just building upon regular public procurement, green procurement, and now sustainable public procurement. These 3 pillars are, originally we started with public procurement on economic side, right? We talked about that. Then moving on to environmental aspects of when governments purchase and how they consider the criteria for how they pick their goods and services. In sustainable aspect, you're also looking at the social aspect of sustainability, which is evaluating the human rights, the fair trade, the fair pay, the labor law, and a whole bunch of other lists of criteria that would be defined as sustainable. Where does that come when it comes to SPP, Sustainable Public Procurement, with our Sustainable Development Goals that we have set up? Then it's right there at number 12, responsible consumption and production. That is where UNEP has, SPP reporting criteria that they're working with governments around the world. As we learned from the previous session, the first step to combating climate change is to first report, collect the data to see where we are, so that way we can plan ahead and be able to practically apply the changes we need in a manner that is balanced within the current social and economic status of your environment. Now, sustainable public procurement may be specific to the SDG goal number 12, but in reality, it really does have an indirect goal on a whole bunch of other SDGs that we just saw here. And here, based on a study conducted by our good friends at UNEP in their reporting, which many of our representatives from the countries herein are representing here today, you see that it impacts many of the SDGs, all the way down to quality education, partnership for the goals, life, water, poverty, hunger, gender equality, and more. So sustainable public procurement, those 3 pillars, you see the transformation from going just for value for money to value for money for whole of life cost changes dramatically the impact of how governments can really impact their markets and the world. But it's not easy. Sustainable public procurement is not a new concept. Here we have our experts within this panel who have been working in this field for decades, definitely longer than I have. And the reality is they have seen challenges, and these challenges have been common, whether it is whatever the income or the level of the country it is, whatever the GDP may be, or the percentage of public procurement of it is. There have been noticing some common challenges. So I am really looking forward to discussing with my panel in some of these challenges, which I'm going to highlight here for our group. And that is, it is perceived that it's more expensive, that it's going to impact the supply chain, and the private sector is going to protest in that regard and not wanting to really adapt sustainable products and services that the government can acquire, because they'll be much more expensive for the private sector and the government itself and the end user. there's a lack of knowledge and expertise that procurement officers are already overwhelmed, and there's very limited capacity for them to start employing, let alone greening public procurement to add sustainability to it. It's just an overload. That's another common challenge that we see all around. The political will and organizational leadership, I think that one explains itself. And there's the legal and commercial environment, which is basically the foundations first to how do you employ a sustainable public procurement, is that there is no legal or commercial foundations to support how sustainable public procurement can be employed in the respective economy. The private sector readiness, how many companies are really ready to, within its resources, to produce the goods and services needed, and on. We can talk more about those, but I'd rather give more time to our speakers to talk. So speaking of that, I'm going to ask a few questions to my colleagues, and these questions I've kind of generated and pulled from talking to many public procurement officers through CLDP's program that range throughout the world, and through my workings also in Egypt here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to pop some of these questions up. But we're here in Egypt, and for I think the past year, I've been working with Sidari about finding ways to advance and expand sustainable public procurement in Egypt. And when I first met you, Sina, I learned something very, very new, is that Egypt has really taken significant steps to at least set the legal foundations for public procurement. Can you tell us a little bit more about what our host country is doing on sustainable public procurement?
Okay, thank you so much. So let me tell you that the story goes back to 2015 when Egypt, in partnership with the EU through the SwitchMed project, initiated the Sustainable Consumption and Production Strategy for Egypt. And two main implementation programs included, of course, single plastic waste minimization and public procurement were selected as top priorities at that time. Accordingly, we started the assessment phase. We started a nationwide, actually, assessment phase on public procurement sustainability practices in Egypt, existing at that time, of course. After that, we've had a number of consultations with international experts, legal members of the parliament, experts in procurement in general in Egypt, government officials. And after that, we came up with a policy recommendation brief, plus we created a manual, of course in Arabic, targeting public sector heads of the training center of what they call the Authority for Government Purchasing, Authority Government Services. And of course, it was specifically initiated in Arabic to target as many as possible of employees working there, people who are responsible of taking the orders or the requirements of ministries, different ministries, and processing them. Of course, this was just one step. The policy recommendation, on the other hand, suggested the possibility of trying to either amend existing laws at that time, because there was an ongoing debate on a new public procurement law that in 2018, in 2018 it was issued. We also offered a possible new model for sustainable procurement within the existing current law as well at that time. The policy briefs also recommend the importance of the sustainability or sustainable procurement champion within the government itself. The need to create an interlinked committee, a sort of a body that links different ministries, important organizations, so they will be able to coordinate and promote further the agenda. That was at 2015. Thankfully, the first recommendation was taken into consideration because we were successful, along with the Ministry of the Environment, to lobby for at least to insert the concept within the new law at that time. Law 182, if I remember, for 2018, in its commencing paragraph, or where they set a set of recommendations. One of the recommendations was that the possibility of adopting sustainable procurement models is highly encouraged. That was the insertion within the law. Although, of course, it wasn't mandatory, I think it was a very, very positive initiation, because it opens the practices and opens the discussion of the possibility of integrating public procurement and starting the process of adopting maybe a whole process or a whole framework for the government at that time. This is in a nutshell what happened. And of course, if you want me to continue, I can continue what the challenges in implementation that took place after that.
Well, I think you really provided a wonderful overview of how Egypt has done, the first homework, which is assessing the legal framework for can you apply sustainable public procurement within the current laws and regulations. And that's really the first step, is the country's readiness to some extent, and that's really great. And the next step really is about recording, and how you can use recording as a way to prioritize sustainable public procurement. And my colleague Yumi from would talk a little bit more about that, because I know you have been working in this field for some time.
Okay, so in case of Korea, we are doing the green public procurement. It's not the KT itself is in charge of green public procurement, and sustainable public procurement is somehow more closely related to the public procurement service. So if I focus my presentation on my introduction on the green public procurement, we have this act called Encouragement of Purchase of Green Public Products in 2005, which is under the vision of green growth, low carbon green growth. So we see the public procurement is very important to achieve the low carbon green growth. Even before the 2005, we have
That's 1 ton right there.
it happens. So even before, if we go to the slide 3, even before the 2005, we have the act related to eco-label and preferential green product purchase. But still, in 2005 act is very important because it made it mandatory for the public institutions to buy, to make a plan for green public procurement implementation, and make it to report back to the Ministry of the Environment that how they performed the last year. So this one is very critically important for us to kick off our green public procurement system. So if we go on to the page 4, now we have over 30,000 obligation followed the public institutions. We have over 30,000 public institutions who is making the implementation plan and reporting back to the Ministry of the Environment. And this is because it is mandatory, and then you have to follow the law. The role of the Ministry of the Environment and KD is aggregating, monitoring, and assessing GPP plan and performance. And not only this, we make a basic plan for promoting green purchase every 5 years. And every year we make establishing and announcing GPP guidelines for the public institutions. And if we go to the next page on 5, we have green products in 3 categories. The most pervasive one is eco-friendly products. And secondly, we introduce a low carbon products, which is introduced in 2021. And we also have the good recycled products. So these certificates helps us to collect the data and the information about the green products. So these, if we go to the slide 7, it shows how different ministries and different bodies are working together. Definitely, Ministry of the Environment and KD is the leading body to implement the GPP considering the monitoring part and the helping the implementation plan set up, and of course, educating and training the public institutions as well. And the other one is public procurement services, and then they are actually set the platform for the public institutions get into the digitalized system and to buy the green products. And public institutions are the body who implement the green purchase. And there, in this diagram, I want to highlight the two parts.
We measure our work on this. It's also important that the key central agencies are leading the way. We're talking about the National Road Administration, the Real Estate Agency, those who have a very big buying power and a lot of resources. We need to be front runners. We need to build more knowledge and competence within the procurement community. We have 3,000 contracting authorities in Norway, and they could not be green experts in all the 3,000 units. But we need competence so they could use the advice and use the template, use the guidance for the way we're going to work with procurement. We need to develop management programs that focus on green and innovative procurement, because what the top management need to build capacity, they need to be front-runners, they need to set the targets within the organization, and we also need to develop good statistics. We need to know what are we buying, who are we buying from, and we need to know what are the CO2 emissions connected to the products and the supply chain to bring this product to the public sector. When we're talking about competence and knowledge, I think it's very important that we, and this is the main role of my agency, because we are the central procurement body in Norway. We give strategic advice and we negotiate framework agreements for the whole of the public sector in Norway. And our key tool to improve the procurement in Norway is through our online guidance. We have a website called publicprocurement.no, and here we are developing a lot of guidance and templates for how to do procurement effective in general, and very specific related to greenhouse gas emission. So we have developed several types of criteria. If you're going to buy transport services, hotel services, ICT, housing, then we have developed concrete targets or criteria that we're going to put in the tender documents. We tell you how to evaluate, how to put this into the contract, and how to have a good follow-up of the contract so you actually see what you have agreed about. We need to gather data and performance monitoring. We need to develop networks around in the procurement environment in Norway. We have developed a help desk, so you could call, give by the telephone, get some assistance if you are struggling with how we're going to do it. We have developed risk and also several calculation tools. We are going to move this one further, but we have developed a calculation in relation to the procurement of food. What are the CO2 emissions related to several categories of food based on where it comes from? We need to provide training, and we have also developed a sort of a beginner's guidance. If you are going to start to work with green public procurement, we tell you how to start, how to implement it, and this is very widely used, and we get a lot of good response on this tool. And also, we have also developed a certification scheme, especially related to the green stuff, which is really important, and you are being awarded if you manage to pass the test. So I think these are very important tools that we have developed, that we are in dialogue with the procurement community in Norway, which I think is very, very important if we're going to reach the very ambitious targets that we are working with. So I will be happy to have any questions about the Norwegian approach, but this is a big picture of what we're doing in Norway.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That really did address a lot of the challenges that we put on in originally when we talked about in the system. I think a lot of countries really aspire to that. As we are sitting here, actually, we have President Joe Biden, I believe, is in the blue zone, giving his remarks and talking about a path to net zero and how we together for implementation. The United States is leading a lot of efforts into collaborating with other governments and leading, engaging on public procurement and going towards a greener and sustainable economies. One of which I heard is about this green governing initiative. Now, I know, Caroline, you've been working very, very closely on this, and I would love to hear more about it.
Sure, thanks, Mace. And I would say I'm so glad that we have a session here focused on green public procurements, which is just absolutely critical because at the end of the day, you've got to follow the money, right? And it's about aligning the financial incentives with also the social and moral incentives of companies. Companies, of course, care about these issues, but movement really gets made because all of you as consumers are making demands, right, of what you expect from companies. And as we talked about just now as well, governments are consumers as well. And so green public procurements really helps make the financial case for companies as well. I'll share a little bit about the U.S. approach first, if I could, and then go to the Green Government Initiative. But, the United States is the biggest purchaser of goods and products, goods and services in the world. It's $630 billion of goods and services every year. And so there's a recognition that, the decisions we make can move markets and incentivize the right technologies and the right moves for the rest of the economy. So, the approach we're taking is pretty comprehensive. It goes to, what we buy, who we buy from, and how we buy. We heard a bit about eco-labels, for example. It goes to the what we buy, who we buy is on supplier disclosure, and that talked about needing to know or wanting to know what the footprint is for your suppliers. And then how we buy is a bit on contracts, and how we train and such. But I'll just highlight two recent announcements from the United States that fit within this framework of what we buy and who we buy in particular. And so first of all, on, the who we buy from, this week, actually, just yesterday, the United States proposed a rule that all major suppliers for the federal government are going to need to disclose their emissions and set science-based targets for their emissions reductions. This is a huge step. This would be the first time that a government is requiring major suppliers to set Paris-aligned emissions targets. And of course, with our global supply chains of $630 billion, we very much hope to be able to catalyze broader movement, not just in the US companies, but also have global impacts as well. And then the second recent announcement that the United States made, and Jonathan talked a bit about embodied carbon, right? Concrete, steel, asphalt, glass, the construction materials that have a lot of carbon in their production, right? So the United States recently announced through Buy Clean, which goes to what we buy, that we're going to prioritize lower embodied carbon in steel, flat glass, asphalt, and concrete. This is about 98% of the construction material the United States purchases. And if you look at just these four products, they account for 50% of US emissions. And the reality is when the United States is focusing on, through Buy Clean, on purchasing these kinds of construction products, we're also supporting and putting money into the companies that are using and developing new technologies that are going to be scaling up lower embodied carbon products and hopefully bring down the green premium that all countries and bring down the price of more sustainable construction materials as well. So we're very pleased about these two recent announcements. And then I want to thank Mace for the question specifically on the Green Government Initiative, because governments, I said, are consumers, but of course in many countries, like the United States, governments are the largest purchaser of vehicles, for example. We are the largest owner of buildings. We are the largest employers. We are the largest consumer of electricity. And so it's, in a way, when we're talking about NDCs, and we talked about, government effort aligning with NDCs as well, you could think about the government sector as, of course, you have to reach net zero as part of your country's movement to NDCs. But what we really hope, and part of President Biden's leadership has been to focus on leadership by example, is embracing the role of leadership by the governments to not just be another sector that decarbonizes, but to actually catalyze, right, and use the levers and the tools it has to enable countries to move. And so in the Green Government Initiative, which the United States and Canada are co-leading right now, there's 44 countries. Norway is a part of it, Korea as well, and many others that you can see here. But all of these countries, in different ways and and the different points in the trajectory, are embracing the concept of governments leading by example and are using international collaboration to share approaches and knowledge and information to really help each other identify maybe new solutions, develop networks that are going to help individuals within countries, get to the solutions faster and support each other. And some of the collaboration is in very tangible ways. So one example I want to highlight is Israel right now is leading a working group that also includes Morocco, Norway, the United States, and Canada on vehicles, right? On green, on zero emission vehicles, low emission vehicles, and greening government fleets. And the way that collaboration is happening is just yesterday, Israel, on behalf of the working group, released calls for information to the private sector to ask about specific things that's going to help governments green their public fleets relating to, environmentally friendly tires, to charging stations. And in that way, really sent coordinated demand signals by multiple countries across geographies to help the private sector understand that there is demand for these products from major purchasers of these things, and conversely, for governments to get information from the private sector that's going to help them better implement, whether it be procurement rules or achieve the broader objectives of greening their operations, right? And so maybe the final point I would make on this front, if I could make, is to say, we talk about procurement and the fact that the governments are the largest consumers of different goods and products. We also heard earlier about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And the reality is, when it comes to government operations, whether you're talking about scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3 for supply chains, it's really all about procurement, right? Because even when you're talking about cars that emit carbon or gases, how are you going to green those government fleets? That's scope 1. Well, you're going to do it by prioritizing the procurement of zero-emission vehicles and electric vehicles and such. So let me pause there. There's a lot more to say, but I'll pause there.
Thank you so much. I know I want to be on time for our colleagues. I know it's been a long day, but I do again want to take a moment to thank our speakers for joining us today. I've learned something new today, and I hope you have as well, in the fact that at the end of the day, all that we're hearing in the blue zone and the green zone the back burner, unassuming lever to really combating climate change is sustainable public procurement. And many governments around the world, including our host country, has taken steps to embrace sustainable procurement and hopefully lead by example in the rest of Africa and support and working with other countries. And we look forward to bringing sustainable public procurement to the front burner and working with governments and with UNEP and CLDP and USAID and all our parties here into putting more programs and technical assistance on sustainable public procurement.